Well, hello and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. My name's Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome if you're a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you are watching my waffling slash musing slash whatever they are for the very first time. I'm just sat here having a lovely cup of coffee. I've just been back in the classroom this morning, so I've had 3 lessons of exam classes and I've really enjoyed it. I'm on a bit of a high, so if I'm going blah 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 blah, I'm perhaps a little bit in teacher mode, and yeah, a little bit sort of euphoric. It was just lovely to be with a load of teenagers again. Yes, I really did just say that. I think teenagers are massively undersold and underrated in society, but there we are. That's a story for another day. So on my knee, I have my latest pile of women's prize non-fiction long list reading. And I'm really loving the fact that many of you are reading these books too, or at least some of them. I appreciate that most people don't have the luxury of the time that I have at the moment to read these books. And I'm proud to say I've managed to read another 4 this week, which really has taken me by surprise. I wasn't quite expecting that to happen, but that's because some of these books I have just romped through. I'm still really enjoying, so I'm actually halfway through the long list as we speak, which is really exciting. So without further ado, I am going to wang on about these books that I have so much enjoyed. So first up, I started this week's reading with Wild Thing by Sue Prideaux, or Prideaux, I'm not sure how I pronounce her name. And this is a biography of Paul Gauguin, the French artist working in the 19th century in France, but not just in France. So it's a very heavy book, but that's because it's beautifully, the paper's beautiful, and there are the most fantastic reproductions of his paintings in here. And I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the paintings, and the illustrations are really well integrated into the text, which they aren't always in art books. Sometimes I find you like, thumbing through a few pages ahead to see the painting that the writer's writing about. So I really appreciated the way that this book has been put together physically, as it were. And I wasn't sure how I would feel about this because it's quite a lengthy book. It's quite dense prose, and I don't mean that as a criticism, I just mean that there's quite a lot to get through. So I thought this might take me quite a time to read. I read it in about 2 days, and that was because I just found the whole thing absolutely fascinating. Now, before I talk about Gauguin, one of the things that I really admired about this, I think Sue Prideaux is a very experienced writer of non-fiction, and what she does so well, especially because some of the issues in this book are quite contentious, she's very good at supplying the reader with lots of different bits of information, but you don't feel it's her throwing her research at you. She's just telling you the story of his life. But she gives the reader room to make up their own minds about what conclusions to reach with the information that you're being given. And I think that's incredibly hard to do when you're talking about something factual and, someone's life. So I really loved, I think this is a beautiful example of how to write biography well and how to wear your research lightly. There is an awful lot of information in this book. It must have taken her a long time to research, because it's not just about Gauguin, it's about other things as well. So hats off to her. And I was hooked straight away because I had no idea that Gauguin spent the first 7 years of his life living in Peru. When he returned to France, he found it really difficult to fit in because he'd, led this incredibly different life. I don't think if I remember rightly, he didn't even really speak French. So he comes to France at the age of 7, and his way of coping is to just tell everybody, I am a savage from Peru. That sentence is repeated over and over again. So, right from the get-go, I was really interested in this little boy with this extraordinary upbringing. He comes from a sort of his family have wealthy connections. So there's an awful lot in this book about money and about the impact of poverty and struggling for money. So although he has wealthy connections growing up, as an artist, he really struggles to make ends meet. And who knew that he started off one of his initial careers, and he made a lot of money out of it, was stockbroking. He was a stockbroker. Stockbroking, I don't know. You know, and I found all of that sort of whole world of moneyed Paris very enchanting and interesting to read about. And then it's, of course, a book about art. So, you know, there's lots in here about the art community in France in the second half of the 19th century. So characters like Degas, who supported Gauguin, was really impressed with Gauguin from very, very early on in his career, but who Gauguin didn't feel he could approach for help when he was struggling. And there's a huge section of the book where Gauguin goes to live with Van Gogh in the south of France. They're sharing Van Gogh's house. I nearly said Gangogh. And Gauguin, I had no idea that Gauguin was actually living with Van Gogh at the time when Van Gogh cut his ear off. And initially, very briefly, Gauguin was arrested for Van Gogh's murder because they thought that Van Gogh was dead. He was curled up in a fetal position on his bed, covered in blood, and the gendarmes thought that he was dead. So you know that there are fascinating personal stories here, and she writes about the development of him as an artist, and the way that he is looking at the world and what he's trying to capture and try to do. I now appreciate his paintings an awful lot more than I did before. Now, the other thing that enriches this book is the fact that Gauguin spent large periods of time in French Polynesia, in Tahiti in particular, and it's a reflection on his experiences there. Initially, he does several things where he really, really misjudges the indigenous population, even though he's very sympathetic towards them on the whole. He makes mistakes, but he earns their trust. And by the end of his life, he is really, you know, he's kind of a go-to person when the indigenous people want support against the French colonial system. So it's a kind of unflinching look at colonialism and the treatment of people under that regime, and particularly as well how colonists behave. All of that really fascinating stuff. And then there's his marriage. I mean, he married a Danish woman called Mette. They had children. This was while he was back in Paris when he was stockbrokering. Seemed to have been genuinely in love, but he's not very functional as a husband in many, many ways. He's very faithful, certainly for the first decade or two, to her, apparently, and he loves his children. They have several, I think 4 or 5 children together, but she ends up going back to Denmark, blah, blah, blah. I hope you don't feel I'm spoiling his story. But what I'm trying to do is just to urge you to read this beautiful book. I thought I'm going to have to put it down now and stop talking about it because it's really heavy and it's making my hands hurt. But I think, you know, you'll have got the impression that I really, really did love it. And then next up, I read Kate Summerscale's Peepshow. And this is the story of Christie, who is a very, very famous serial killer living in London in the 40s and 50s. And I didn't enjoy this book because of the subject matter. I think it would be a really inappropriate statement to make. I found aspects of this book really interesting. The Christie story is quite well known and has been written about a lot. And the reason that Kate Summerscale, I think, called it Peepshow is because she's partly exploring the response to the murder from the tabloid journalist Hare. Oh my goodness, his name's gone out of my head. Harry Proctor, that's right. So we sort of get introduced to Proctor. We learn about his childhood. And Harry Proctor was really troubled when Christie was arrested, because there'd been a murder in the same building at 10 Rillington Place, a murder of a wife and child some years before, and the husband of the woman who'd been murdered and the father of the child had been arrested and hung for the murder, because the death penalty was still in place in London at the time, in the UK at the time. And Harry Proctor, the journalist, was really troubled by this, because he had interviewed Timothy Evans and had not even considered that this might possibly be a miscarriage of justice. And I think he'd interviewed Christie, I can't quite remember now. So I think one of the things that Kate Summerscale is exploring is Proctor's motivation, that he is trying to get to the truth. He's trying to he feels as though Timothy Evans was not guilty of that murder, and he feels that he's got guilt associated with it because he didn't see that coming. And he'd also been involved, Harry Proctor, in the case of Derek Bentley. There's a very brilliant film where Chris Eccleston plays Derek Bentley called Let Him Have It. And Derek Bentley was a man with learning difficulties who was hung for shooting a policeman, or not shooting a policeman, telling someone else to do it. I can't remember the name of the other guy, Chris someone. And Chris was not hung because he was too young, and Derek Bentley was, despite the fact that he didn't pull the trigger. And Harry Proctor had actually been with the Bentley family on the night that, waiting at the house on the night that Derek was hung. So he'd had a close association with that family. He'd worked on that story. And so Harry Proctor had real questions about the validity of the death penalty. So he's kind of really, really desperate to get to the bottom of Christie's guilt, and in particular to find out whether he was involved in the murder of this mother and child. There was no doubt that Christie was a murderer. I mean, there were 3 women found in an alcove behind his kitchen, for example, and also he murdered his wife. So, you know, it's a grim, grim story. And I think for me, that was a problem, because it felt, to me, reading something like this is in a way, it's not my type of book. I feel it's kind of voyeuristic, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be asking questions, but I'm not totally sure what new information this book throws up. As I say, there's been a lot written about him before. One of the things that she is definitely trying to do is to restore dignity to his victims, because a lot of Christie's victims were prostitutes, women who were sex workers. The vast majority of them were either pregnant or had recently been pregnant. So, and at the time, the sexism and the attitude towards women in the sex trade was just appalling. And I hadn't realised quite what a problem the sex trade had kind of exploded after the Second World War, and I had not realised what an issue that had been in London at the time. So all of that was very worthy and very interesting. So, you know, there are things in this book, and also there's in the background to all of this, there's the suggestion that the Tory government at the time of Timothy Evans' murder were trying to cover up or prevent an inquest into his death, because traditionally Tories have supported the death penalty, and so the suggestion is that, you know, they didn't want it to be shown that there'd been a miscarriage of justice, because that would then be a really good argument against the death penalty. So all of that, you know, there are aspects of this book that I found really interesting. At times, I felt like there was a bit of padding going on. Sometimes there were just sort of lists of people, and I wasn't quite sure how they were connected or what the relevance was to what was being told at the time. It was a bit patchwork and a bit piecemeal in times. So I think if you're interested in murder and possibly in the psychology of murder, then you know, you would find this a really interesting book. For me, it just didn't quite hit the mark. And next up was What the Wild Sea Can Be, The Future of the World's Oceans by Helen Scales. Now again, this book is so well researched and I really like the way she writes. It's clean prose. It's, you know, she is covering so many huge topics, things that I find it really difficult to get my head around, like the development of the world's oceans is kind of where she starts. And then she uses a whole series of kind of case studies. I mean, she really had me hooked when she was talking about, I mean, who knew that there were giant sloths swimming in the world's ocean millions of years ago? I mean, I love a sloth, so that really did it for me. Just visualizing that, it was worth reading just to know that. She writes about things like, you know, how, because this is a book about the creatures living in the world's oceans and how they're being impacted, I don't really like that as a verb, by human activity, the Anthropocene era, and how we are creating huge problems for these creatures, but also for ourselves. And so she looks, for example, at the case of lionfish and the way that they, I think she's quite an expert on lionfish. I think she's done a lot of research on them herself. And looking at the way that, you know, they were only found in a couple of parts of the world's oceans, and now they are spreading here, there and everywhere. And of course, they're predators on other creatures. So she looks very closely at that, and they keep recurring during the text, so it kind of gives you something to pin the ideas on. She also looks at how man specifically, you know, she looks at the things that you might expect, things like, you know, the impact of plastics and so on. I had not appreciated until I read this book just how much more sensitive sea creatures are to temperature change compared to other animals in the world, because there only has to be a very, very minute shift in temperature for sea creatures to not be able to survive. And that was, you know, there are lots of things in here which were, you know, I think I'm reasonably well informed, but which were real news to me. I loved it when she wrote about the impact of the Suez Canal. Like initially, when the Suez Canal was built, it didn't create a problem in terms of animal migration because it was a series of sort of salt lakes, so the water was too salty. But over time, as the canal was widened, that then allowed for animals to migrate into the Mediterranean, the creatures that wouldn't have been able to do so before, you know, stuff like that. There's a caveat for me, and this is a very personal thing, in that because of the way my brain works, when I'm given lots of information, I feel like I should retain it. I don't like it when I'm reading things and the information isn't lodging. And you can see there were lots of things that I really gained from reading this book, and I think it is a superb book. But for me personally, I was suffering as I read it from information overload. And maybe that's because I was trying to read it all in one or several goes. You know, perhaps it's the sort of book that I would have been better off dipping in and out of rather than trying to read it from cover to cover. But what a masterpiece, and what an amazing woman to be able to bring all this interesting stuff about the world's oceans to the attentions of, you know, the attention of an audience like me. And I just love that cover. I mean, I just think it's beautiful. And then the final book that I read, and I read this in a day, it was Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton. And I think this book is, and I use this word a lot, I realise, when I'm describing books, but I would describe this as an exquisite piece of writing. Chloe Dalton, during lockdown, was living in her home in somewhere in rural England. I've not even quite managed to nail where it is. It doesn't really matter. She's a very sort of she's worked as an advisor to people like William Hague, former Prime Minister of the UK, in lots of sort of very contentious parts of the world. So she had a really she had the sort of job, as she describes it, where she would be dragged, she would be the one outside the party on the phone working while there was a party going on. A real sort of workaholic, really loved life in London, but also grew up in somewhere rural. In fact, I think very near to where her barn conversion is in this book. And during lockdown, in fact, I'm pretty sure it's during lockdown, she hears barking in her garden and she goes out to investigate. And after the barking has subsided, she finds this leveret. Leveret is a baby hare, and there's no sign of a mother, and it's clearly traumatized, and she doesn't know what to do. She knows enough to understand that if she picks it up, the mother might reject it because it will pick up her scent. So she gets a clump of grass and she scoops it up and she takes it inside. And the book is about her relationship with this leveret. And it's just, I have never really had pets. I'm not naturally, I grew up in a household where my mum was really frightened of most animals. So I have never had a really close relationship with animal, and I don't think she had either. And it's just brilliant the way that she sort of, this leveret takes a hold over her life, and the way that it makes her look at the world around her in a completely different way. So, her curtains get nibbled and she doesn't care. She's more bothered about the leveret. Even the way that her garden is, the boundaries in her garden, she starts to see in a completely different way. And this leveret becomes tame but not tame. And there's a really interesting power dynamic between her and the leveret. The way she writes about the countryside is beautiful. It's really poetic without being overly done. It's really poetic, beautiful, flowing prose. And I love the honesty, the way that she is really honest about sometimes just, feeling like she needs to sort of go back to London and get some sort of normal life away from what's happening to her. And the various there are quite a few sort of traumatic moments in here concerning the leveret. And also, you see, with this one, I don't want to give too much away. I think if I say too much, it might spoil the reading experience. But I think this is a really charming book that demonstrates what a hold the countryside can have over you, and also how when you live somewhere rural, perhaps you become more aware of the seasons and the changes. Yeah, I mean, through this animal, she starts to look at her garden differently. She starts to plant different plants. She starts to, the power that her relationship with this creature has is phenomenal. So I just thought, I thought this was an absolutely delightful read. Every single one of these books, all four of them, I can absolutely see why they were longlisted. I totally get it in every case. And now I'm 8 in, and I've got another 8. I haven't yet started number 9. I know which one it's going to be, but I haven't started it yet. And I still don't know how I'm going to choose my favourite 6. And I don't know how the judges are going to do it. Please, please, please keep posting your thoughts about these books. Particularly if you've read any of the 4 that I've just talked about, I'd be very interested to know what you think. But I'm having an absolute ball. And I know now I've managed to post the first 2 weeks. There's going to be a gap now because I'm back in school for 3 weeks. So I've sort of, that's why I wanted to get on with reading this first 8, because it takes the pressure off me a little bit. So I suspect there might not be another video for a week or two. We'll see how we go, because I might just make the most of my weekends. But yeah, wow. I mean, the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, I am absolutely in love with it. That's all I can say. Take care, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.